Drop your questions in the chat box. Okay.
Yes, sir. Hello, sir.
Okay. Tell me.
Sir, please send the WhatsApp group link in the chat box.
You create your own WhatsApp group and share the link with me. Right. You become the
Sir,
admin.
sir, is there any WhatsApp group going on now or not?
No, I didn't create any WhatsApp group. You
Uh-huh.
create one
And sir,
group
the
and add me.
okay, okay, sir. And sir, can you please tell me your number, WhatsApp number?
Number is yesterday I gave you the number 94372
94372. Yes,
59420.
59420. So 94372 59420. Is it?
And yeah, whatever your problem is, you just type it in the chat box. We'll discuss. Okay.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
So can you say, see my sharing?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. We'll begin today short fiction, Australian short fiction or short story, and you have 19th and 20th century short fiction of Australia, which tells us about um, the milieu, the land and the place, all types of geographical descriptions and the convicts and their life, all the things we'll find as in case of Australian poetry. So also in case of Australian short story, we find the same milieu, same themes, and a question comes here, or a question often comes up in our mind: why should we read short stories? Now, as we all know that time constraint today, we don't have time to read longer versions of any write-up, whether it's a novel or a drama or an epic poem. We prefer a short writing in order to have judgment here and now. We don't want to wait for some time. That is why the short story version is very popular nowadays, and we can also have the same kind of feeling about short story. So this is story. How can we define a short story or short fiction? Actually, a short story, the focus in the short story, the focus is on a single dominant theme. Even though so many characters are present in the story, we find the focus on one main correct character. Other characters, even if they exist, they don't have any major say in the story. They only revolve around the protagonist. That is why the focus is on single dominant theme, single dominant um, protagonist or character. And as we all know, that fiction or story, we have known it from our grandmas. So the ancient myths and folk tales are, or the oral tradition is the basis of the short story or short fiction. And here we will concentrate on a very working definition given by Edgar Allan Poe, a very famous American short story writer. He was born in the year 1809 and died in the year 1849. The American short fiction or short story writer, he believed that a short concentrated story, or what he called a brief prose tale, was better suited to the times as people lack leisure hours. We don't have much leisure time now. That is why we take up the short story. He was also of the opinion that such a story could create a powerful, strong, and single impression to the reader. His views made practical sense and prompted many writers to work in the short fiction or short story form. Several writers have collected their works for inclusion in single volumes. Writers like William Faulkner, Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, Guy de Maupassant are a good examples of short story writers who have made all the great and who had popularized this short story form. And what is the scope of short story or short fiction? And we all know that um, short stories are very interesting in nature, and the narrative style is only um, it concentrates on a short span of time, which is a prose narrative requiring anything from half an hour to 1 or 2 hours in its pursuit of the tale, and which concentrates on a unique single effect and one in which the totality of the effect is the main objective. So this is by J.A. Cuddons. The short story um, has, however, achieved such flexibility and variety that its possibilities now seem almost endless. We have infinite possibilities of short story writing at present. For instance, it could be concerned with a scene, an episode, an experience, an action, the exhibitions of a character or characters, the day's events, a meeting, a conversation, or a fantasy. So many things can be included in a short story, and this is the class story or the class fiction that we cover today. And the Australia, like the British and American tradition of short story writing, the Australian writing is also very famous. And Australia also provided the writers with ample material, the geographical variety, the convict story and the Aboriginal story, the bush and the bush ranges, all give a kind of stuff, a kind of ready-made stuff for the ripening of the short story. And mm, the island continent, that is Australia, was meant for transporting convicts from the mother country. In other words, the convict systems, the Bruce Rangers, and the Aborigines, the country itself, with its forbidding, bizarre, and extremely fascinating myths. Um, we have all the things present in Australia. So that's why it's a rich flower bed for short story writing. And the periods from 1830 to 1860 and 1860 to 1880 and 1880 to 1893 are roughly chosen for the development of short story. Now, the past period, 1830 to 1860s, tells us about how this short story form has flourished in Australia. So John um, Hoyson's The Tales of Colonies was the earliest to appear in 1830. Most of his stories are set in Ireland and the West Indies, but one story, One False Step, is set in Australia. The story bears a visible resemblance to English tales of adventure and crime and is exciting and rather fast moving, with a lesson to be taught at the end of it all. However, David Bond of the our first lieutenant and fugitive pieces in prose, 1842, fame is better known than Harbison. Bounce was a playwright and his longest piece, The Three Sisters of Devon, is much like the 18th century picaresque novel, but he had a flamboyant style and he wrote by circumlocution and evasiveness. His style was very euphemistic. For the next 50 odd years, most writers of short fiction followed Bond's style of writing. Between Bond's Our First Lieutenant and Fugitive Pieces in Prose and John Lang's Botany Way in 1859, about 15 volumes of tales set in Australia or with Australian themes was published. Popular writers of those days were Mrs. Biden, Tales for the Bush, which was published in the year 1845, Mrs. Charles Clancy, Lights and Shadows of Australian Bush Life, published in 1854, and Henry Giles Turner, The Confessions of a Loafer and the Captive of Gypsy Land, uh, Tales of a Colony, 1857, Mrs. Bidel wrote for the lower classes, or the servant and being the wife of a parson, was prone to didactic preaching in her stories. The Black Troopers, 1850, by an anonymous writer, is worth mentioning as it deals with the pursuit of an aboriginal criminal by troopers of his own race, led by a white lieutenant, and has been compared to Thomas Kinley's 1972 novel The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith. It is memorable for such an account of the pursuit of an individual is not to be found anywhere else prior to this story. Mrs. Clancy's stories, on the other hand, are about people who are either moving from England or have just arrived in Australia. She appears to be promoting emigration to the colonies. The tales told by Turner appear to be a catalogue of disasters and could have been written as a response to the propaganda of the guidebook novels of the 1840s and 1850s. John Lang is one of the first Australian writers before Lawson who dealt with events in the history of the colonies. It is possible to gain some insight into the life of the period through his of the convict period, but while he does not provide an um, elaborate social history of the times. She does not convey a sense of the atmosphere of Sydney and other parts of the New South Wales during those early years of the settlement of the colony. The descriptions of the landscape, flora, and fauna are essential to the story and not mere descriptions. So, this is about short story in the early period. From 1830 to 1860s. And now we come to the second phase, 1860 to 60s to 1880s. Between 1859 and 1880, 8 volumes of the short stories were published in Australia. Three writers were prominent during this period: Horace Early, James Skip, Borlas, and J.R. Houlding. L was prone to writing the guidebook novel that we talked about earlier and dealt with the flora and fauna of Australia. His short fiction was collected in the Ups and Downs, 1861. Most of his stories are set in the bush. James Ball's um, Ball's collection, Darling Deeds, 1868, are stories of adventure but are also sadly lacking in characterization. They are holding old boomerang was one of the sadly lacking stories which was sadly lacking in characterization. Um, Sorry, J.R. Houlding, Boomerang, was one of the moralist writers. The stories in his Australian Tales and Sketches from Real Life, 1868, are relatively more indirect in their preaching than that of other writers. The most important writer of the period was, however, Marcus Clark, uh, about whom we will have a detailed discussion in the next unit. Clark was a pivotal literary figure then, though there were some good stories written before him, and even after the stories rise only occasionally to his level. During this time, several detective stories, as well as the tales of mystery, were also being written. From 1887 onwards, tales of mystery, intrigue, and detection became very popular. Then we'll come to the third phase, uh, which began in the year 1880s and ended roughly in 1890s. While the 19th century saw industrial and material growth and the loss of pastoral lands, as is lamented by this instead in the old school, even so, the after effects of the Darwin's origin of species supernaturalism too found a place in the fiction of the times. Tamsa Jesse Kubier wrote ghost stories like the Rubria Ghost. Other writers used ghosts in a serious manner, like P.J. Holdsworth in A Tale of New Year's Eve or Bruce Wood Grains. Good short stories continued to be written after 1880s, but Marcus Clarke was one of the best writers, and none were there before Lawson to counter Clarke's position. The manner in which language was used then and the way it is used now are quite different. Even the use of certain words like mate had acquired a different connotation, as you will observe when we read the stories in this blog. As Cecil Headcraft rightly points out that the term mate as address was less frequent. It occurs in the third person, not so much in the second. So this page introduces to Clark, and this man is a very prominent short story writer in the later page of Australian right, and some women writers were also prominent in the short story arena. While the novelists is concentrated on a few themes like a pastoral life, the convict system, and the bush, they did not really deal with the urban life. The theme was utilized by Rosa Preed, Tasma, and Aja Cambridge, but the writers of short fiction were able to produce different gear genres like tales of murder and mystery, detective tales, historical and didactic encounters with aboriginals, and other forms of short story. As Headcraft points out, however, even within this diversity, no development in the history of short fiction really occurred. For instance, if we look at the vast body of literature surrounding the convict system, we will discover that though there is so much material on this one topic, it does not develop into a genre by itself. Having said this as an introduction, let us try to discern for ourselves whether this is true or not as you deal with Marcus Clarke, Caesar of Cyprus, and Henry Lawson's The Drover's Wife, and the Union Buries its Dead, Barbara Bayton's The Chosen Vessel, Steed Rod, Cranky Jack, and Krishna reads the old school. These stories and the authors belong to different ages and have used different themes. Moreover, the manner in which they handled these themes and their writing styles will bear testimony to the development of the short story as a genre. However, this does not mean that the short story as a genre did not develop. What Cecil had grasped indicates is the fact that, unlike the picaresque regional stream of consciousness technique novels, to name a few, these independent Australian short stories on the convict system, on the harsh hostile natural habitats, etc., did not develop into independent genres. So, with this kind of introduction, we will see, we will move to the bulletin years. Bulletin is the bulletin we talk about is the Sydney Bulletin, where the periodical or the paper publishes so many stories by Australian writers. The short story gained popularity because it was published regularly in the Sydney Bulletin of the 1890s. The writers who were normally associated with the bulletin were Henry Lawson and Barbara Benton, along with Edward Dyson, Ernest Pavins, and Prince Warong. Lawson, as mentioned in the introduction to the period, wrote poignant stories about male bonding, virtues like endurance, courage, and honesty against a harsh environment and an unfriendly, even hostile outlook. For instance, his stories like Robber's Wife, and the Union Buries Its Dead just describes the hostile environment, the convict story, all the things. Barbara Baton's vision of human nature ranges from the stern to the hopeless. Those of her characters who were not weak, dishonest, cowardly, cruel, or downright evil were always dominated by those who were, and the manner in which she draws on the Australian outback is remarkable. She frequently presents it as not only bleak and harsh, but as in her terrifying story, The Dreamer, as actively malign, the stop of nightmares. So, this is a kind of introduction to the 19th century Australian short story. And as we move into the first half of the um, 20th century, we'll find more polished form of short story and the short fiction in the later half of the 20th century gave us another important themes or and so many important things that we um, associate with 20th century Australian short story nowadays. The 1950s was notable for the writings of Frank Hardy, the man from Chinkapella, and other prize winning stories. 1951, Judah Wharton's The Ellen Swan, 1952. Judah Wharton anticipated migrant writing by some 30 years. These two writers are closely linked by their overtly political motivation and their concentration on characters from disadvantaged social groups. Another contemporary, John Morrison, was also in the same league. In 1972, the censorship ban was lifted. The first issue of the short story magazine, Tabloid Story, was published, and government supported the arts in a new and fresh manner for the first time. Frank Morehouse and Michael mm, Wilding gained prominence during this period with the quality and innovativeness in their fiction and in relation to the tabloid story. The new fiction of the 1970s was characterized by a schism from the hitherto realist and nationalistic stories, though Patrick White's and Hal Porter in the 1960s had already broken off from this tradition to a great extent, as had Stevens, who wrote in the fabulist mode. The fabulist mode was swiftly becoming the dominant trend and had started as far back as the 1930s. Peter Cowan, the Teens and Other Stories, and Mobile, 1975, experimented continuously with the short story from form in which he exposed the frustrations, bitterness, and futility in contemporary living. Christina Stead was yet another force to contend with at that time. Elizabeth Bable comments on Krishna states Salzburg's tales. Quote, the vitality and stylistics and formal variety of State's stories would I think, be quite a revelation to younger Australian writers who would be staggered to discover her anticipation of the current fabulist mood. The new fiction was largely influenced by contemporary European and American writing and incorporated such elements as fantasy, surrealism, experiments with narrative chronology, and narrative voice, a new awareness of the role and status of the author in the story, and a generally enlarged consciousness of fiction as fiction, of a story as an artifact rather than a simple reflection of life. Common to all the Australian writers of this period of Australian short fiction is an acute and articulated awareness of there being no simple, uncomplicated relationship between language and experience. Brian uh, Clenan's The Most Beautiful Lies, 1977, is an anthology of stories by five writers Murray Boyle, Peter Carey, Maurice Lowery, Frank Morehouse, and Michael Wilding. All five of them shared the same preoccupation. Of these five writers, Peter Carey was the most concerned with fantasy and surrealism. Bale was preoccupied with the nature of language and writing. Morehouse with the narrative experimentation and the ways of writing frankly about sex, while Wilding shared all the above preoccupations. So, in this way, we are moving gradually to the immigrant or migrant and Aboriginal short fiction and how it developed in Australia, and we're into this field now. Archie Waker's collection of stories, Going Home, which was published in the year 1986, is the first by an Aboriginal. This could probably be due to the fact that the shape and language of Aboriginal story tells telling did not easily fit within the short story mode. Stephen Miriki, Cream Bentrak, and Paddy Rose Reading the Country, published in the year 1984, demonstrates the difference quite accurately. During this period, experimental writing increased steadily. Beverly Farmers, Milk, and Home Time, 1985, are examples of Greek stories that invert the migrant experience and reflect the cultural and social vertigo of Australians in Greece. Gerard Winston's The Harlots Enter Fast, memoirs of the assassination attempt, gained critical notice. Helen Gardner's Postcards from Surface, Surfers, 1985, has her famous piece on the life of art. Frank Morehouse moves away from charting the moods and movements of a counterculture and towards a closer attention to individual experience Trouble Transgression with the publication of his three later works, The Everlasting Secret Family, 1980, Room Service, 1985, and 47, uh, uh, 4017, 1988. These works, in these works, his concerns with the narrative structure, narrative voice, and the relationship between experience and language is maintained and balanced. So here we had a brief analysis of Australian stories in the 19th and 20th century. So when we see the whole scenario, there is a marked shift over the last 15, 20 years in the literary community's focus of story writing. Hitherto, the focus was on Australianity and towards a more local based vision of place. Thereafter, the focus shifts drastically and an examination of the works of David Moloch, amongst others, will make clear the manner in which this shift takes place. By writing his fictional autobiographical works in the manner he does and through his narrative native Brisbane, David Moloch has arrived at an aesthetics of locale. His dual Edmundston Street, 1985, a collection of autobiographical essays, presents insight on the relationship between places and the self, and the ways in which that relationship can not only be expressed but are constructed. New regional ways of reading fiction of earlier writers. Regional anthologies since then have been abandoned. Queensland's Latitudes uh, editors Susan Johnson and Mary Roberts, and South Australia's Unsettled Areas edited Andrew Taylor. Regionalism can be seen as yet another experimental mode that is continuously moving away from an oversimple preoccupation with nation. It is another way of classifying, thinking about, and most importantly, writing stories. So, this serves as an introduction to overall introduction about Australian writing. And in Unit 2, we'll move to, we will focus on individual writers and the first writer that we'll discuss today, the short story writer we will discuss today is Marcus Clark. And his famous story, The Seizure of the Cyprus. Marcus Clark is a very famous story writer and who used to write regularly in the Sydney Bulletin of the 1890s. In Marcus Clark's case, however, his stories were published by other papers and not so much by the Bulletin. The Melbourne Bonds, the Australian Monthly Magazine, Australian Daily Telegraph, Australian Journal, and the Leader published Clark regularly. Clark's stories, particularly the story we shall be analyzing in this unit, is the seizure of the Cyprus, belongs to the convict tradition, or what is sometimes also called the tales based on historical facts. Needless to mention, all of us are by now familiar with the history of Australian settlement. Australia was meant to be a parent settlement for England, and anyone convicted of a crime, no matter how petty or heinous it was, transported to Australia in an effort to lower the burden on English prisons. Some of other writers that dealt with this theme were John Lang, Marcus Clark, Thomas Walker, and William uh, Ashley, Prince Warren. It is, however, difficult to say how many of them actually saw the transportation of convicts to Australia, for the system was stopped in New South Wales at around 1840 and to Tasmania at about 1855. The only writer who could have seen this site personally would be John Lang, though Marcus Clark may have seen, as Cecil Headcraft points out in uh, the Australia short story before Lawson. Quote, ironed convicts, talking dog sleep in the little force castle or at meals in the prison, and the miserable relics in the asylum, and crippled, self-maimed emancipates in the streets of Hobart. He, however, could no way have witnessed chain gangs nor any active brutality, unquote. And this convict's story has influenced the writings of Marcus Clark in more than one ways. And he's a man of many talents, Marcus Clark. Um, he is also a novel writer who deals with the convict life, his natural life, than for his other writings. He was famous for his natural life. His novel has been reprinted and re-edited several times, has been dramatized, filmed, and translated in many languages like Dutch, German, Russian, and Swedish. Mark Twain, the American novelist and popular creator of Hawkpin, comments, quote, I may tell you that we think a deal more of Marcus Clark in our own country than I'm sorry to think you do here. Um, this is a very famous saying by Mark Twain about Marcus Clark of Australia. Marcus Clark's fame rests largely on his novel, his natural life, but he was also a short story writer, a journalist, a reviewer, an editor. Definitely a versatile genius. His other early publication was The Lady of the Lake, one of those items concluding the evening's show in a Melbourne theatre. Marcus Clark had, however, already made his presence felt on the literary scene of Australia, particularly in Melbourne. In 1867, he began writing for the Argos, a daily that published a weekend magazine of literary interest, where Clark wrote reviews and theatre criticism. One of the earliest pieces he wrote for the Australian was an essay on Balzac. Balzac was a famous literary pioneer and revolutionary critic whom Clark greatly admired and identified with. According to Michael Wilding, Clark's portrayal of both the Melbourne bohemia and the bourgeoisie was greatly influenced by Balzac. The same year, he began writing a column for the Australasian um, called the Peripatetic Philosopher, um, which proved to be instantly successful and later formed part of his first book. The topic uh, closest to his heart was that of expatriation of or the behavior of the new migrants to the question of and relationship with relationship to whom he wrote politically prolifically during this period, mixing in a world of similar literary and journalistic talent. In 1868, Clark, along with his associates, formed the Bohemian Group, Bohemian Yorick Club. The other writers of the age who were co-founders of the club were Adam Lindsay, Henry Kendall, G.G. McCrae, F.W. Haddon, J.J. Sillinglow. Another important feature of 19th century Bohemia was theatre, and Clark showed marked interest in this genre. He proved to be a prolific playwright. He wrote several plays, adapted, translated, and collaborated with several other playwrights as well. Apart from his column, The Peripatetic Scholar in the Australasian, he also started writing a series of articles in 1869 entitled Lower Bohemia. The series is considered to be one of the most successful and sustained journalistic projects. It is written in the manner of exposed journalism, and Clark wrote on subjects like the immigrants' home, the cheap lodging houses, the bars, and the eating places, and on the plight of the absolutely homeless. He is, of course, better known for his novel, His Natural Life, than for his short stories. However, as his fame rests on his novel, it would be a good idea to take a quick look at his novel. Marcus Clark serialized his novel His Natural Life. Though his book was planned for 12 installments, he took 28 months to complete it. For those who had never been to Australia then and had envisaged it as another Eden, Clark's writings managed to shatter that illusion. From a historical and social point of view, Clark's uh, his natural life is a record of society bereft of the civilizing constraints of Victorian England and can be considered as a vision of human nature at large. His natural life then does not merely stand for the specific terms of the prisoner's sentence, but for the natural life of a man in a new environment totally devoid of any human constraints. This freedom from constraints does not indicate a positive attitude, but that of a reversal of all human faculties. We see man in all their brutality, degradation, and despair within this convict system. According to Whiting, the cumulative effect of the specific evils of the convict system is a vision of the futility, the hopelessness, the meaninglessness of human life. A Natural Life is one of those novels that take the reader back and forth through the narration to the documented reality on which it has been based. The convict years from the basic story line, but Clark has given the documented material an aesthetic appeal. So, when you see the analyze the themes in Clark, we can find out two dominant themes. There are two predominant themes in Clark, particularly in the old tales. These are that of exile and brutality. Clark conveys the fate of the exile, whether voluntary or otherwise, very effectively in his writings. When studying Australian literature, it would be helpful to remember that Australia was established as a penal colony meant for deporting petty or hardened criminals away from the homeland. Largely, Great British Empire, apart from those who were exiled due to their criminal records, there were also the second and following sons of not so big houses who desired to seek their fortunes at sea or in another land. Then, with the great Australian gold rush, thousands of people migrated to Australia with the dreams of acquiring wealth instantly. Keeping this in mind, it is easy to relate to Clark's predominant themes of exile and brutality. And when we come to see the old stories retold, were collected in book form and published as Old Tales of a Young Country, 1871. But Nathaniel Hawthorne, as a writer, did for American literary history, Clark tried to do it for Australia. In order to fulfill his self-chosen literary history, his self-chosen role of literary historian, he tried to create a sense of history by drawing attention to the romantic past and by creating archetypal characters and situations. This collection of 15 stories um, is full of references to all the heroes and anti-heroes of English classics. By doing this, what Clark proposed was an indication of the romantic tradition in Australian writing that was comparable with that of the old world's literary tradition. He also explored the romantic possibilities of these characters in his famous work, His Natural Life, but he is able to convey these sentiments without overemphasizing the Australianness that has been frequently adopted by many writers. He appears to be one of the few writers of that period who kept away from writing about the great Australian ethos. The Aboriginal community is, however, markedly absent from the writings of Clark. He appears to have very little or no sympathy at all for the black community. His attitude was a simple, uncomplicated form of racism. In this connection, he may have been largely influenced by the notion of what was acceptable to literary usage. He emphasized um, intentionalism more than narrow Australian nationalism. He He emphasized internationalism more or multiculturalism or cosmopolitanism more than narrow Australian nationalism. He is largely responsible for putting Australian literature and the romantic material available within this literature on par with other national myths. He had a very complicated cosmopolitan outlook and he laid stress on that same nature of Australia's early history. So he meditated between cosmopolitanism and Australian themes, typically Australian themes. And when we come to the relevance of Marcus Clark in the 20th century, we can see remarkable significance. Throughout the 20th century, Clark's other writings fell out of print and critical notice. He also suffered as a result of the devaluation of the colonial period in an attempt to blot out the convict past of Australia and as a result of the rejection of writers not born in Australia. Instead, though born and brought up in Australia, was not considered Australian enough, while Marcus Clark was rejected on grounds of not being born in Australia or um, uh, born an Australian. Um, I would like to take a 2 minutes break. Hello, କରିଥିଲେ ଯେ ମୁଁ କ୍ଲାସରେ ଅଛି ଯେ କୋଉଠି ଅନଲାଇନ କ୍ଲାସ କରୁଛି କୁହ କଣ ହେଲା କି କୋଉଠି ହଉ ମୁଁ ସାଢ଼େ ଆଠକୁ କହିବି କାହିଁକି କହିଲେ ମୋର 8ଟା ବେଳକୁ କ୍ଲାସ ସରିବ ତ ହଉ 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 हाँ हाँ ठीक है सर. Thank you. Now we'll come to see what the story which is prescribed for all this seizure of Cyprus is all about. The story Seizure of Cyprus is a romantic one, and if it does not equal in interest and the story of the capture of the Frederick, of which I shall by have occasion to speak, it is remarkably as showing the condition of convict discipline in the early days of the colony. Macquarie Harbour, abandoned in 1833, was in these days the ultima thule of convict settlement. Established in 1821 by Governor Sorrell as a station for the most irreclaimable of the desperados who were sent in shiploads from England, this discipline had gradually increased in severity until it became a hideout terrorism, which often drove its victims to seek death as a means of escape. The picture of the place, as drawn by Blackhouse, the missionary who visited it in 1832, is most dismal. The scenery is wild and barren, the scrub and undergrowth impenetrable, and from the swampy ground around the settlement arises noisome and death-dealing exhalations. The sharp beating with violence on the rocky shore renders the approach difficult, and the westerly winds blowing with fury into the harbor opposes sometimes for days the departure of the convict vessels. This place was the last home but one of felon once sent to the hell. As the abode of doom was termed by the prisoners, the return was all but hopeless. The iron-bound coast, the dismal, impassable swamps, the barren, rugged mountain ranges combined to render escape impossible. So this is the description of the story, a bit of entry into Marco's class world of stories. To this place, Lieutenant Carey with 10 soldiers set out to convey 31 prisoners. As not infrequently happened, the weather proved unfavorable, and the vessel put into a richer bay for settler. The prisoners were all desperate men. Two of them had been before at Hell's Gates and detailed the horrors of the place to the companions. In the semi-darkness of the lower deck, where chained in gangs of four, the miserable wretches speculated on their doom. It was proposed to seize the ship. A prisoner named Ferguson was the ringleader. At the worst, said he, it is but death, and which of us wishes to live? But the others were not so bold. Degraded by the chain and lash, they yet clung to life as the one thing the law had not yet taken from them. So this is the battle between life and death that Clark describes in the story, and the description. is as lively as possible. And even today, when we read, we can have goosebumps by reading this passage from the story. So there are other examples or other glimpses of cruelty that we find is associated with the convict life, and the story is full of that. Now, when we try to analyze the um, story, the seizure of the Cyprus, we will have certain reservations uh, and how the suffering and the loneliness of the convict life has been presented in the story is remarkable. The seizure of the Cyprus is a tale about 31 prisoners with 10 soldiers and a lieutenant on board the ship Cyprus. The captain and the soldiers are part of that remote authority that we talked of earlier, dispensing justice far away from home. They represent the authority figure while the prisoner faces the bond of injustice and cruelty. The conditions were such both en route from the home country to Australia and on the islands used as prisons. Such were the state of affairs there that the convicts would rather attempt an escape than face imprisonment and torture on the island. They were treated like beasts. The man lived the life of beasts. All the atrocities that man could commit were committed here. The reputation of Hell's Gate at the prison was called preceded it, and men who had been there before made it known to the newcomers. These conditions led to the germination of the idea to rise in a mutiny and seize the ship that was carrying these 30-odd prisoners. Plans were hatched. Some were afraid of the consequences and clung to that one thing that had not been taken away from them life. Others were bold enough to anticipate freedom or death, whichever was their destiny. It was better to attempt to flee from these authorities, maybe even die in the attempt, than to live in servitude in Hell's Gate. This again reminds us of certain words of Milton's Paradise Lost, Book 1. Quote, "It is better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven." Only here, the prisoners would prefer to try and flee, maybe even die in the process that then to stay alive and to live bound by the chains of servitude. An interesting point that may be noted, however, is that despite being hardened by the life they lead as convicts, they have still managed to retain some of their human kindness. This is made clear when they seize the ship and Baron the captain with his party, but they don't harm him. His wife. Instead, they even leave provisions for them. Even before we are told of the seizure of the ship, of the plans to seize the ship, we as readers are made aware of the bleak future that awaits the prisoners at Hell's Gate. The very words, this place was the last home, but one of the felon strikes a terror in our hearts. The ensuing sentences compound our sense of terror and horror and invoke both pity and fear in our hearts for the prisoners and the inevitable fate that awaits them there. The attitude of the prisoners on board the Cyprus is rather typical. They are a few blow-bitten souls who would not take the risk of revolting against the authorities. Others could not care less either way Yet some would sooner die trying to break free than live in chains for the rest of their lives. Finally, 13 convicts decide to try and sail from their freedom. Once a flee, they are uncertain about their future. The description of this standard party brings to mind Coleridge's Ancient Mariner. The two stories run parallel thereafter, one of the Cyprus and the convicts now sailing to freedom, and that of the lieutenant and his men marooned on the island. While the marooned souls eventually find a ship and are rescued, the convict story has another ending, spinning yarns about their being shipwrecked. The 13 manage to get rescued and reach the shores of London, where they are captured all over again. So this story is a heartbreaking story, and it tells us about how freedom from earth, freedom from prison, is like leading a life of hell, and wherever they go, they do not have any kind of freedom. That is perhaps this is in their destiny. This is in their fate to suffer even after moving from the hell's gate.